Yeah, I just met him last week, actually.
Good evening, everyone.
He's a really sweet guy.
He says that the magic man, as Ann Palin says, that I can't use the microphones until everybody's quiet, because then you can hear me. Can you hear me now? Yes. Excellent, it worked. Good evening, I'm Sterling Wilder, and I'm class of '83 and the Director of Alumni Affairs, and we are delighted to have such a wonderful turnout this evening, so thank you for being here, and especially thanks to our wonderful panelists, who you'll be hearing from in just a very few minutes. My first duty is, and not a duty, it's a great pleasure to thank Hogan and Hartson for once again hosting us here this evening. Hogan Lovells, oh, sorry, I forgot that. We also have several members of the Duke Club of Washington board with us here this evening. If they could stand and just be recognized quickly. It's not hard. Stand. Thank you. And these women are in large part responsible for helping to put on this event, along with Elizabeth Jackson and Jim Warren from Campus College Connections. And also I want to recognize Ann Pelham, who's class of '74 and the immediate past president of the Alumni Association. And we also have several Duke staff here if you want to raise your hands, so hopefully folks can have a chance to say hello at the end of the evening. So just really quickly, Women's Forum's events are wonderful. As you can see, they're a great way to engage large numbers of women across the country. And we've had Women's Forum events and programming in New York and DC for quite a few years, and we expanded that to LA a few years ago, and just last week we launched the Houston Women's Forum, which is very exciting. If you're ever in Houston, let us know. We also will be launching Chicago in December and thinking about next steps for Atlanta and Charlotte. So what you all are doing and Kim's work and vision is really catching on, and so we're grateful for that. And we hope that you will keep coming to Women's Forum events, but also think about programming on campus for women. Every other year we have a Women's Alumni Weekend. Just last February it was Money, Sex, and Power. Andrea was one of our panelists, and Money, Sex, and Power is the name of a women's studies class, just in case you have any questions to how we got to that. But it's great programming and really been fun, a fun adventure for all of us, and thank you for being part of it. I also want to give a quick plug for next Thursday night, if you happen to be in Baltimore, that President Broadhead will be with a program called The Duke Idea, of which Judy was one of the panelists and stars in New York in March a year ago. But President Broadhead will be in conversation with Mike Merson, and Dr. Merson is the director of the Duke Global Health Institute. So we hope that if you're in there or want to make plans to attend, and we also have...
But if you don't feel like trekking all the way out to Baltimore, you just have to go to DuPont to one lounge for the Duke Gen networking event. And Duke Gen is an international organization all around entrepreneurship. So it's open for all Duke alumni, parents, relatives, anyone who's related to Duke, who is an entrepreneur, interested in entrepreneurship, wants to do business with entrepreneurs, just looking for a job, or looking to meet some really interesting people. So we have a LinkedIn group. We're on the Duke website as well, and the Fuqua web, and all the different schools' websites. And it's just here at one lounge at DuPont on Thursday the 18th.
And any questions, you can find any of us, and we'll be able to help you. So that was our quick plug. Again, thanks for being part of the Duke Alumni Association. You remember our tagline is Forever Duke, because it is a lifetime of association. So I'm going to turn it over to Kim Reed, class of '86, and she is the incredible motivator and leader behind the Women's Forum in DC. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. And I want to thank our fantastic panel for being here. I also want to pass on the regards of Andrea Martin, who was supposed to be one of our panelists, but had a very serious bike accident last week that required immediate knee surgery. So she is very happy on pain pills right now and didn't think that she would be as effective a panelist. So at the last minute, Andrea LaRue, who is absolutely wonderful and will represent the party well, has agreed to step in. So we very much appreciate that. I want to say just a very quick word about Duke Women's Forum. I see mostly familiar faces here, so I won't belabor the point. Duke Women's Forum is intended to span the decades of Duke women graduates, as well as Duke women who are otherwise affiliated with Duke, as spouses, parents, friends of Duke, people who maybe just took a course there at some point. We want to span the decades to bring together women in social, political, and networking events in order to find ways that they can remember Duke fondly and go forward with their Duke connections in ways that will benefit them as well as the university. We have a number of events throughout the year, including these types of panels, and I invite you to go on the Duke Club of Washington website to read more about the Women's Forum. I want to say very quickly, too, that we have represented in this room the classes of 1948 through 2010. Isn't that cool? 62 years of Duke women in this room. I think that's awesome. Thank you so much for being here.
Ask the 2010s to stand up.
Can the 2010s stand? Yay! You guys are the future of Duke Women's Forum, and I will draft you to do something for us, so expect a call or email from me soon. Before I introduce the panelists, let me say that all views presented here tonight are those of the panelists personally and do not reflect upon the views of their employers, affiliates, or political parties. So this is obviously a closed session. There's no media here, so we hope that that will facilitate open and free discussion. Let me introduce the panelists very quickly. I think you will understand, based on Judy Woodruff's qualifications, why I have chosen to do a short bio, because I could talk about her qualifications from now until 8:30, the end of this program. Judy has covered politics and other news for more than 3 decades at CNN, NBC, and PBS. For 12 years, she served as the anchor and senior correspondent for CNN, anchoring the weekday political program Inside Politics. From 1983 to 93, she was the chief Washington correspondent to PBS's MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. And from 84 to 90, she also anchored PBS's award-winning weekly documentary series, Frontline with Judy Woodruff. In 2007, she completed an extensive project on the views of young Americans called Generation Next, Speak Up, Be Heard. In addition, she anchors a monthly program for Bloomberg Television, Conversations with Judy Woodruff. And through the fall of 2006, she was a visiting professor at Duke's Sanford Institute of Public Policy, teaching a weekly seminar on media and politics. She is the founding co-chair of the International Women's Media Foundation, an organization dedicated to promoting and encouraging women in communication industries worldwide. She serves on several boards of trustees and boards of directors. At Duke, Judy earned a degree in political science and was involved in the Student Union, the Publications Board, AD sorority, and ASDU, the precursor to the Duke student government. She, as everyone knows, is married to the wonderful Al Hunt and is the mother of 3 children. Cathy Haley is sitting to Judy's left. Catherine currently serves as the policy advisor to House Republican leader John Boehner for education, labor, and social issues. She is responsible for developing policy and coordinating strategies for Republican members of Congress and their staffs on behalf of Leader Boehner, soon to be Speaker of the House Boehner, we assume. She previously worked in the offices of U.S. Representative Pete Hoekstra, U.S. Senators Tim Hutchinson, Don Nichols, and Kay Bailey Hutchison, as well as for the Subcommittee on Health within the House Ways and Means Committee. She conducted clinical cancer research at the Lombardi Comprehensive Cancer Center at Georgetown in her pre-med days, right? And was awarded a research fellowship at the Center of the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School to examine faith and medicine. Very interesting background. She earned a BS in psychology and a certificate in human development from Duke, and she holds a master's degree in government from Johns Hopkins University. To Catherine's left is Andrea LaRue. Andrea and I grew up in the same very, very small dot of a town in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, and I think we're the only 2 to have ever gotten out. I'm completely
Definitely
serious.
the only ones that went to Duke.
Yeah, that went to college out of state, I think. Yeah. Andrea is a 1987 grad of Duke with a BA in psychology, and she was a member of Tri Delt sorority. She earned her law degree and Master's of Public Affairs from the University of Texas, Austin, after which she managed 2 successful congressional campaigns and was part of Dick Gephardt's national field staff during his '88 presidential run. After practicing labor law in a D.C. law firm, Andrea joined then Senate Democratic leader Tom Daschle's staff as legal counsel. Andrea is now a partner at NVG, a Democratic-leaning lobbying firm with all-female principals. She is married and has 2 children, aged 11 and 8. I'm now going to turn the program over to Judy Woodruff because I can't think of anybody in the world better suited to moderate this panel. So I'll turn it over to Judy. Thank you.
That may be a slight exaggeration, but Kim, I thank you. And I'm going to actually start pulling this back because once we, if I can, because once we start talking, we want everybody on that side of the room to be able to see us. Yeah, we need a little heft, a little muscle. There we go. There we go. Okay, good, good, good. Okay, all right. So, thank you. Now that we've shown that women are just as strong as we need to be, I am so happy to be here. Kim, thank you for that very generous introduction. I am just constitutionally unable to say no to Duke requests, and so I say yes, and I'm thrilled to be here. However, I have to say that the more I've gone to Duke events over the years, I increasingly find that the attendees graduated from Duke long after I did. And so tonight is no exception, and I have to say I'm just thrilled to see those of you who are 2010 graduates and to the 00s and the 90s and the 80s. It's great to see all of you, 70s and earlier. I will also tell you that I was on campus just a few weeks ago, had a chance to talk with President Broadhead, and I can report that he's doing well, and I think this Baltimore event that's coming up that Sterling was telling us about sounds so exciting, and I hope that some of us from Washington are able to go there. And by the way, I think that entrepreneur event here in D.C. sounds exciting too for women of all generations, and so I hope there's a good turnout for that. So I'm before I get started, I have to say that it's been nice to get to know Catherine. She and I have gotten to know each other over the last few days. Andrea and I have known each other, but have kind of lost touch, so it's a treat for me to get back in touch with her. And I think you're going to find when you hear from them that both of them have the kind of really deep experience and deep knowledge about what's going on in the Hill and what's going on in this city that is going to make this a very rich discussion tonight. I'm going to give some overview remarks, and then I'm going to turn it over to Catherine and then to Andrea, and then we're going to open it up. I'll ask them maybe a few questions, and then we'll open it up to you in the audience, and I think we're going to try to go till about 8:30, so start thinking of your questions right now. The midterm elections, in case anybody here has been asleep for the last 7 days, they did happen, and the Republicans won in a blowout. The votes are still being counted, as probably some of you have heard, in a handful of districts, but we think there will end up being 97, 98, I'm not sure how many new members of Congress of the House of Representatives. At least 88 of them are going to be Republicans, 63 of those in districts flipped from the Democrats. Only 9 of the new members of the House, I believe, and Catherine can correct me because she's watching this even more closely than I am, are Democrats, and just 3 of those came from districts that had been Republican. So you can see it was a wave, and it very much was a wave in the Republican direction. Over in the Senate, there is one seat that's still technically up in the air, or I should say just up in the air, and that's Alaska, but I don't think there's any doubt that it's going to go Republican because the 2 candidates in the race, still in the race, are the write-in candidate, Lisa Murkowski, who's a Republican, and Joe Miller, who had won the Republican primary. But it's clear in the Senate the Republicans have picked up 6 seats, not enough for a majority, but putting them in a much better position in the upper body. The margin there is going to be 53 Democrats to 47 Republicans, incorporating those independents who vote with one caucus or another. And by the way, I think the numbers in the House will end up with, Catherine, correct me, is it 185 Democrats and 200 and how many Republicans?
Well, you're giving us the benefit of the doubt of several races that have yet to be called.
Okay, that have yet to be called. But it's something like the Democrats will have if I'm not mistaken, a few number of seats in the House, as few as they have had since something like the 1930s. It goes way back since the Democrats have been in such a small minority in the House. Now, among governorships, the Republicans picked up 6 more of those for a total of 29. That does put them in the majority among the governors, including in states critical in presidential election years, states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Iowa. And they picked up at least, and this is very significant, 19 House chambers across the country. That number could grow. A number of those ballots are still unresolved. Significant because it is the state legislatures that are going to be redrawing congressional and legislative districts in the months to come, heading into the next election, and also, frankly, because the laws that are passed at the state level, the interpretation of laws that are already on the books, are increasingly important, and we can talk about that later. But just a few more statistics that tell us a little bit more about the results of last Tuesday. First of all, it was mainly about the economy. When voters were asked what was the main the issue that influenced your vote, 62%, and this was the exit polls. These are the polls done of people as they come out of their polling places. 62% said it was the economy. It blew away every other issue out there. Women divided almost evenly between the two political parties in how they voted. They did favor Democrats by just 2 percentage points, again, according to the exit polls, but that's a major blow to Democrats because they have consistently won a clear majority of women over the last few decades. So that tiny margin among women was not nearly enough to overcome the 12% advantage that men gave Republicans. Men voted by 12 percentage points in favor of Republicans last Tuesday. The only age group that voted Democratic were the 18 to 29-year-olds by a lopsided margin, but they made up just 1 of every 9 voters. They were only 11% of the electorate, and so their vote was hardly dispositive. Every other age group, and especially those 65 and older, voted mostly Republican. Probably the most important political demographic, though, to remember is independents. People who describe themselves as independent favored Republican candidates 55% to 40%. That is a big swing just from 2008, 2 years ago, when Barack Obama was on the ballot and when independents went solidly Democratic. And since we are a women's gathering, you might be interested to know that among Republicans, there are 24 women who have either won or who are leading in their districts for the House of Representatives. I understand just 1 of them is unresolved. That's a pickup of 7 newly elected Republican women House members. And among Democrats, 56 women ran, 48 were successful, so 8 fewer Democratic women in the House than there were previously. And since we are a Duke gathering, here's the latest on Duke in the new Congress. I picked this up from something I got the other day. A total of 7 Duke alums are going to be serving in the 112th Congress with the election victories of Republican Senator-elect Rand Paul in Kentucky and new Republican House members Ben Quayle, Arizona, and Mo Brooks from Alabama. So 3 Republicans, all from Duke, and they join returning members of the Duke caucus, which includes Shelley Moore Capito, West Virginia, Republican Dan Lipinski, Democrat Illinois, Ron Paul, the father of Rand, Texas, and Nick Rahal, another from West Virginia, a Democrat. So I didn't give you all the names, but it's just a sense of who's going to be in the Congress watching basketball, at least part of the season. So I've thrown these numbers at you. Let's talk quickly, at least from my perspective, about what it means. Looking at the exit polls, looking at a lot of other polls, and talking to people who spend their lives analyzing all this, and I did spend several weeks during the fall season out on the road covering a number of Senate races. I was in Wisconsin, Nevada, California, North Carolina, and a couple of other places. It is clearly a rejection of Obama administration policies, clearly a rejection of the White House. It's a call for more effective and efficient government. And it is driven by the anxieties and the insecurities of a 9.6% unemployment rate, and the fact that 41% of the jobless have been unemployed for more than half a year. That is double the percentage at that same level during the recession of 1982 and 83. So people are hurting. I don't have to tell anybody in this room, and that is clearly the main driver behind these results. What I would argue it is not, however, is a widespread affirmation or a clear endorsement of the general Republican prescription to slash taxes, drastically cut spending, undo health care, undo financial regulation, and other regulatory matters. The exit polls, which, again, I would argue are more reliable than the usual polls, because they, in this instance, I think they interviewed something like 15,000 voters across the country, way more than they normally do for a regular poll. And they asked them about the economy and government spending. When people were asked, what's the top priority for the next Congress, 39% said reduce the budget deficit. But an almost identical percentage, 37%, said the absolute priority is to spend money to create jobs. And another 18% said to cut taxes. So we know that that's on the mind of 1 in every 5 voters. Exit polls, when people were asked about the health care law, it's gotten a lot of attention. 48% said repeal it. 47% said either expand it or leave it like it is. The voters were quite clear about what they didn't like, what they don't like, and far less certain, I would argue, about what they do want other than better times. They want jobs. They want the economy to get back on track. They want the country headed in a better direction. If that all sounds confusing when you read and you hear some of these exit poll numbers, it is. Elections are often confusing in what voters are saying. And I believe we are going to see the dichotomy of last Tuesday play out in the weeks and the months ahead. And it centers, I think, on what is really a quite different interpretation privately of the results. We're going to hear from Catherine in a moment about this, but my reporting tells me that many Republicans will argue these results are a mandate to pursue their agenda. Repeal the Obama health care law, extend the Bush tax cuts for all, even the wealthy, and very large cuts in domestic programs and in government and government spending. They are looking for the White House to make concessions. And we're going to hear from Andrea in a minute. And my reporting tells me that the White House, meanwhile, and many Democrats believe that if that all happened, that would be an enormous overreach. They note, yes, Democrats are viewed unfavorably, but so, they would argue, are Republicans. Democrats argue this is the first time, perhaps ever, that a party that took power had a standing as low as the Republicans have today. Polls show Republicans are viewed about 34% favorable, about 41% unfavorable. So it's lopsided. People were saying, we don't like what the Democrats are doing, but we're not in love with the Republicans either. Let's see what you both can do. And by the way, this is just about the reverse of Republican favorability standings back in the 90s, 94, when you had the last big Republican takeover of Congress. We're going to be talking about the leadership competition, I'm sure, in both parties' caucuses. But one other important point to keep in mind, among the 60-plus Democratic House members who lost their seats, almost half of them were described as moderates, members of the so-called Blue Dog Caucus. These are moderate to conservative Democrats who had the kind of folks who'd been urging their party to adopt a more business-friendly, a more fiscally conservative agenda. They happen to represent districts that were most likely to flip to Republican. So the remaining Democrats in the House of Representatives are what? On balance, more liberal. Meanwhile, the Republicans who were elected last week tend to be, and I don't want to make any sort of broad sweeping statement, even though I'm obviously doing that, standing in front of you, they tend to be more conservative. Why? Because many of them are backed by the Tea Party movement in one form or another. I don't believe there's any official tally of results, but the number of winners, this is based on news reporting and what we've been able to put together. We looked at this at the NewsHour last night. The number of winners who claim some Tea Party backing includes at least 5 senators and anywhere from 28 to 40 House members again, based on news reports, because there is no official tally. The Tea Party takes many different forms in different parts of the country, and even in an individual state, there are different, the Tea Party Express, the Tea Party entity in one form or another. And in Nevada, I was with a group of people, one group who was meeting, and they were asking the Republican candidates to come and talk to them, and there were 3 different Tea Party groups at that gathering. There was the Tea Party Express, there was the traditional Republican Party, and there was something called the Friends of the Founding Fathers. And they all professed to be connected to the Tea Party. So that's the kind of thing that has made it difficult to sort of calculate how many exactly belong to the Tea Party. So all of it, what does all this mean? It sets up a Congress that is more divided philosophically even than the current Congress. And it raises questions about what they're going to be able to work together on, what they're going to be able to accomplish. It's clear they are far apart on many spending priorities. Certainly they're far apart on health care and a number of other issues. But I do believe that we're going to see cooperation on a few issues as well, because most voters were saying, we want Washington to get something done. I think that you're going to, first of all, you're going to have to see some kind of agreement on tax cuts, because neither party wants to see taxes go up on January 1st. You're going to see a fight over how long the tax cuts for upper income taxpayers should be continued, and whether they should be so-called decoupled from taxes for middle income taxpayers. But all in all, you're going to see an extension, certainly for the foreseeable future of these tax cuts. I also think the 2 parties are likely to be able to work together. I'm saying this on November the 9th, on pieces of energy legislation, potentially education, a START nuclear arms reduction treaty, possibly other areas like trade. But the end of any election is always the kickoff for the next election. And you're going to start to hear, and you already are, a lot of talk about 2012, the presidential race. President Obama, who's running against him? Is there even going to be a challenge in the Democratic Party? Who's running, who isn't? And before you know it, that's all we're going to be hearing about. And I think everybody here hopes that, before that happens, members of Congress will have a chance to get something done. Finally, I don't believe that this was what they call a watershed election, or if it was, I don't think we can possibly know that yet, because we have seen voters swing back and forth almost wildly in the last decade, certainly in the last 2 years, the 2 years before that, and if you look back at what happened in 2000. For now, the Democrats clearly have their work cut out for them, but until we see what happens 2 years from now and beyond, I don't think we're going to know if this was a start of something more long-lasting. So with those hopefully brief introductory remarks, I'd like to introduce Cathy Haley for some comments, and then we'll hear from Andrea. Cathy.
Okay, well, hi, my name's Cathy Haley. Thank you so much, Judy and Kim and Sterling. It's really exciting to be here and also to serve on a panel here with you, Andrea. I do work for House Republican leader John Boehner and have worked with him for the last 2 years, so for this whole Congress. Just to give some background, at least from a Republican perspective in the House, earlier this year, the House embarked upon what we'd like to call a listening session. We felt, based on the legislative agenda that was sort of pushed through in 2009, both with what we call cap and tax or cap and trade or the health care bill, we felt that overwhelmingly individuals were more focused on the economy and not so much on those two things, and were sort of somewhat felt a little frustrated that Congress wasn't necessarily listening to them. So what we embarked upon earlier this year was what we called the America Speaking Out Project. This was something that utilized all forms of online technology, where individuals could weigh in and sort of input to Congress what was most important to them. So you had grassroots organizations, you had individual citizens, people could vote, you could watch yourself get points. You could get little email updates saying so-and-so, a group of people have voted on you, on your idea. It's now in second-ranked position. Anyway, that served as the platform, what we called in September, the Pledge to America. And it was based on 5 things. And those 5 things were a plan to create jobs and address the economic uncertainty. The second was to stop out-of-control spending and reduce the size of government. We felt we heard a lot about that, both at roundtables, from members, from constituents, that the growth of government was just way too big. There was a plan, from our perspective, to repeal health care and replace it with common sense ideas. The fourth was a plan to reform Congress, because many would probably say that it is way too partisan. All we do is have bills on the floor for 2 hours that are thousands of pages in some sense. Nobody knows what's in it, and we need to go back to the original intent of Congress of a rigorous debate to address the problems facing our nation. And finally, the 5th plan was to keep our nation secure at home and abroad. This was not a campaign document. This was one that could be implemented today if given an opportunity to debate these issues on the House floor. The pledge was not necessarily explicit on the issues that we wanted to address, although most of the points that we raised do have actual legislation that have been introduced by our members, or even in some cases bipartisan support. It was ultimately the Republican, the incoming Republican majority will use the pledge as a foundation to push for spending to pre-bailout and stimulus levels, so back to the fiscal year 2008 spending levels. Ultimately, yes, cut taxes, and all with the goal of creating jobs. Just a few things. Judy gave us the benefit of the doubt that we will have more than 83 Republicans. There are 6 seats that haven't been called, 9 Democrats. And for us, this is the largest freshman class that the Republicans have had, or the greatest number of Republicans the Republicans have had since 1946. And this gain well exceeds the gain in 1994. So many people look at 1994 as the 52 seats that we gained there as being very, very historic. I wanted to talk briefly about sort of what does our freshman class look like. Some have held public office, some have been mayors, some have been statewide office holders, some have served in their state senates or in their state houses. Many have business backgrounds or have been entrepreneurs. We have several car salesmen. And we have quite a number of healthcare providers, both physicians, MDs, and osteopathic physicians. We have a number of nurses, some that have been in healthcare consulting, and that's both men and women. Many kind of indicated that they got into this race last fall when they recognized that their members of Congress had voted for the health care bill and they felt that it was the wrong direction as a provider. Some other things, just sort of as Judy mentioned very briefly, some of these were Tea Party candidates. And so there's been a lot of talk about what does the Tea Party look like? Who are the Tea Party? In many cases, there's sort of this anti-establishment candidate. Some are fiscal conservatives who ultimately want to decrease spending and they want to impose a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution so that Congress, the federal government, has to operate like most states. I think it's something like 46 states operate under balanced budgets, meaning at the end of the day, what they take in is the only amount that they can take out or spend. For a number of these candidates, they have stated that they look to the Constitution for Congress's legislative authority. That's something that Leader Boehner has indicated that come next year, a requirement for legislation that will be debated on the floor, individuals will have to state their literal legislative authority for bringing that bill to the floor. Others have said, which sometimes they do and a lot of times bills don't, And a slight caveat on that, this year, I forget the number, but it was something like between 1,000 and 2,000 resolutions were considered on the House floor, and they were everything from recognizing Duke basketball, which we really appreciated, to recognizing, I don't know, like Carolina for something, which is not very fine, or a lot of sports team recognitions, which is fine. Everything's fine, but if that's what we've spent however many thousands of hours this Congress debating, I think we've gotten a little way away from where sort of just House is supposed to be a deliberative legislative body, and I don't know if naming roads and post offices and creating a special week for something or a month is the best utilization of our time. And then finally, some are both fiscal and social conservatives. Ultimately, the Tea Party is a grassroots network of activists who are sick and tired of the direction of the federal government and so in the direction it was headed. It's not a national organization or even something controlled by a few groups, which Judy alluded to. There are many spokespersons. Some have said, well, what do you think about Sarah Palin? It's like, well, Sarah Palin is just like any other person that has an opportunity to command an audience. She energizes a ton of people, regardless of whatever you think about that. Some are serious, some are inflammatory. There are others who are committed to conservative principles that are very, very serious. Finally, ultimately, I think I could say that many Tea Partiers, their priorities, I think, are most House Republicans' priorities. They're everyday people who have had enough, and they are very concerned about their futures. I read an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks ago by Peggy Noonan, and the headline that caught my attention was sort of the Tea Party saved the Republican Party. And quite frankly, her thesis is something that really resonated with me. I think that the Tea Party called into question spending, deficit reduction, growth of government, all things that Republicans had not done for almost a decade. You know, if you really look at what's happened, Republicans were big spenders under President Bush. We didn't do a ton of oversight. We created big, huge programs. And we didn't necessarily question, because we had both chambers, I don't think we did a very good job of questioning the direction of the president. You know, legislative branch is very different than the executive branch. And I think we sort of left a lot to the administration to decide. So ultimately, I kind of agree with her thesis that Republicans were no longer the party of limited government or fiscal constraint as it had touted in 1994, and it had become quite the opposite. So similar to what Judy said, I'd like to say that this election was about jobs. It was about the economy, spending, and government. Yes, absolutely, other issues are at stake, and I think there might be common ground on those things. But the underlying factor among voters was that they wanted to stop the uncertainty about job creation, they wanted to stop spending, and they wanted us to stop comprehensive reform bills that nobody had any idea what was in them, let alone staff. And ultimately, I think members looked to staff to say, okay, tell me what's in that bill and how it'll affect my district or state. And quite frankly, I don't think most staff nobody had ever read all of the health care bill in its entirety, let alone the cap and trade bill. And getting an amendment to the overlying bill to be debated on the floor at 3:30 in the morning, there's no staffer in his right mind that can be ready to go at 9 a.m. with thorough talking points to say, boss, this is how it's going to affect you, and this is how it's going to affect our district. So I think ultimately, this election, I think people wanted us to say, some people would probably say, I think I read something in The Economist this past weekend. It was sort of talking about the conservative mindset of individuals and how they voted on certain propositions. And I think I'd have to agree that it was sort of my take on the election was people were saying stop and slow down. We want a conservative government in a sense of we want a slow changing government. So this next couple of weeks I think will be very interesting. Next week Congress will be back in session for the beginning of the lame duck session. Parties in both the House and Senate, Republicans, Democrats, everyone will be electing their new leaders. We'd like to think that Leader Boehner will be selected as sort of the top Republican, but he would not be voted as Speaker until January 5th, when Congress will be back in session. And ultimately, I think as Republicans and Democrats select their leaders, I think they will begin to put in place their agenda. In the House, I think Leader Boehner intends to put in motion the points outlined in the pledge, those 5 things that I mentioned in the beginning, so jobs and the economy, out-of-control spending, addressing the health care bill, reforming Congress, and finally, national security. And ultimately, he has promised on many occasions throughout the last couple of weeks to create a more open and transparent House, one that takes back its role to provide oversight of the executive branch, thoroughly debate and vet legislative ideas, and take its responsibility of power of the purse very seriously. So it's going to be an exciting time regardless, and I look forward to your questions.
Hi, I'm Andrea LaRue, and you're going to have to bear with me a little bit because I was the backup speaker, so I was working on the babysitter, not a, well laid out speech here. So, well, I want to thank Sterling and Kim. It was a pleasure to be invited, and it's an honor, obviously, to be with Judy, and it's great to meet you, Catherine, and to be with all of you. I hope afterwards I get a chance to say hi in a more complete way, since I kind of rushed into the last minute. This was a tough election if you're a Democrat. It's not surprising. It's 10% unemployment. And I spent the last part of the election in Nevada, and in Nevada, the unemployment figure is more like 15%. And if you're in parts of urban America, the unemployment figures are closer to 20%. So 1 in every 5 adults is out of work in so many of our major metropolitan cities. So it's not a shock that things didn't go that well. I do believe that because we kind of came rearing in and did a bunch of stuff, we kind of failed to articulate an economic vision at a time when people were incredibly insecure about what their future holds and whether their kids are going to have, a safe and, complete future. So I wasn't shocked by these results, but it still hurts. It's definitely a lot of mourning going on, and a lot of people out of work, obviously. For people like, Catherine, on the Democratic side, there's probably going to be about 1,500 Democratic staffers that will lose their jobs as a result. So you can imagine there's this giant churning in my world right about now. And they won't all stay in town. The system can't absorb everybody. It's a really treacherous environment right now. Judy does amazing reporting, but that isn't the case for everything that we see on TV and that we read on the internet and that we read in papers. And it's an environment that I think, it's hurting our politics. It hurts voters. It hurts kind of our citizenry. I've seen so many new lows this election. I can't even go into them all. But, it's something that I hope that we can all work on, both on the left and the right. I think there's plenty of guilt to go around on all sides. There were some really interesting things that went on in the election that, haven't been talked about already that I do want to touch on. And one of them actually is Sarah Palin for me. I came to start calling her the female Emily's List about 6 months ago because, like it or not, there's a woman who wouldn't have won the primary in New Hampshire, who's our next senator from New Hampshire, who Sarah Palin backed. There are 3 Republican governors that she backed. There's 8 new House women members, Secretary of State, an AG. So, you know, she kind of did, I think, on the Republican side for a bunch of women candidates, what Emily's List has been doing on the Democratic side for 2 decades now. And, you know, again, like it or not, I thought that was interesting and exciting, frankly. And, you know, I, boy, wish that we had more candidates on the Democratic side and with her political skills, because she's got them. The other story that I was following throughout this election was the story of the Latino vote. The Latino vote was a lot of people are calling it the firewall in the Senate. And just to read a few things, the percentage of the Latino vote in Nevada went from 12% of the electorate in 2008 to 15% of the electorate in 2010, and Reid got those voters 90-8. Wow. Boxer in California, the percentage of the Latino vote went from 19% to 22%, and Boxer, based on exit polls, got those voters 86-14. And Bennett, a guy that everybody thought was toast 3 weeks ago, stopped giving him money, pulled out of the state, went on to other things. Colorado. Yes, of course, Boxer, we know her, and Reid, we know her, but there's this guy named Bennett, and he's out in Colorado. He's got to increase his profile, because that's one of the reasons everybody thought he was toast. Latinos went from 9% of the electorate in 2008 to 13% of the electorate in 2010, and he won those voters 81% to 19%. And if you asked Latino voters, you know, when you ask Latino voters, this is one of the, I think, the giant misperceptions about how immigration plays with Latino voters, is that when you ask them what's their #1 issue, they'll say jobs. Everybody will say jobs in this environment. Not a big shock. If you ask them what's the most important issue that you voted on, 60% of them say immigration. And what those voters saw was a party, the Democrats, saying, you know, we want to do something to legalize your communities. You know, we understand the situation and it's unsustainable. I mean, Janet, you know, Barack Obama is deporting 400,000 people a year. So there's an upheaval in these communities. They want to hear there's a solution around the corner. And on TV, there were some critical mistakes made by Republican candidates. Both the Senate Republicans that I just read you the totals on, the candidates in those races, in all 3 races, they were ads that, you know, depicted Latinos as kind of gang members that are kind of crossing the border and invading your communities and making you more unsafe. And the reaction in the Latino community was, one party's talking about a solution, one party is demonizing my community. So it's not surprising that you saw this like 80-20, 90-10 kind of vote for Democratic candidates. I think that's important for the long term, because I think in the next presidential coming up in 2 years, that's really going to matter. And I think it's one of those issues where, you know, if the Republicans kind of stick to what Catherine's been talking about in kind of the 5-point plan, maybe they keep this issue off the table, in so to speak. But if, you know, Lamar Smith and others he's going to be the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, not the best friend to the immigrant community, put new facts on the board, you could see this getting even more cemented. And this is a very bad long-term trend for the Republicans, a very positive one for the Democrats. The entire Southwest is being reshaped by the Latino vote. This is also going to matter because in terms of the long-term trends with respect to redistricting. As Judy said, one of the most devastating things to Democrats in this election is that we got creamed in state houses and in the governor's races. And so when we're about to redraw all the districts, I actually did this in Texas in 1990. You know, you sit there with computers and block level data and you divide up the spoils of voters into all the congressional seats, and some states get new seats and some states have to subtract seats. Guess where we're adding seats? We are always adding seats in pretty much the same states where the Latino population is growing. And so while I see kind of a short-term real setback on kind of congressional redistricting because of this devastating election. I think that the Latino vote and what happens with respect to that vote long term could really erase the gains that Republicans make in the redistricting process, because this population is growing, and it's growing in the places where there are going to be more seats. So that was my number one story on election night when I was trying to wear my positive hat. So, and it's always good to try and find a silver lining, when you're looking at results like that. What went wrong? Well, like I said, I think it's the economy. I also think what was really interesting is that we had an incredibly productive legislatively 2 years, an incredibly productive administrative 2 years, but it was like we overate. And the American public said, bite-sized pieces, please. Cut back on the carbs. I'm like, I'm really full. And I can hear that. I mean, the healthcare bill is huge. Financial bailout, big deal. Financial reform, the auto bailout. I mean, people forget this, right? That we stood up 3 car companies. I guess Ford wasn't going to go bankrupt, but the other 2 were. So these are big interventions on a big scale, and people are like, okay, retrench. What I think is also kind of coming out of this and trying to be silver lining too, as a Democrat, what does this mean for us going forward? Obviously, we need to provide an economic framework. I think we need to find places to work with Republicans. I think Judy pointed out some of the top line ones: education. You could say smaller energy package, something on taxes. Things are going to roll out like that. But, Democrats do have to kind of really think about how do they want to govern still. It's not like we're the opposition party. Still got President Obama, still sitting in 53 seats in the Senate. So this has kind of been a crouching week, but come January, it's 2/3 of the political process are in Democratic hands. And so there isn't this ability to just step back and say, well, let's see what the Republicans are going to do, and we'll roll with that. That can't be our plan, because we're still governing. So there's a lot of work to be done, and a lot of people are in long meetings. I find myself in a lot of long meetings. But I do think we'll come out on the other side, and I hope that even though there's such structural barriers to getting along, and there are also political barriers to getting along, that we can find a common agenda that does focus on jobs, education, kind of some pieces for long-term energy security. And that's kind of my summary. And of course, I've got a million things I could say, but thank you for inviting me.
All right, we're going to open it up to all of you, but I do want to start with just one question and ask both of you. I mean, both parties say their main focus is create jobs, that the one thing that needs to be done, that the country is hungry for, is for jobs to be created. And clearly there are different visions. The Democrats, to some extent would talk about creating jobs, putting money into programs that would literally create jobs that are government funded either in whole or in part. Republicans would talk about creating a climate in which jobs could be created. But give me some specific things that you think could come out of this Congress in the next months to come that the American people could look at and say, aha, that's more jobs. I mean, we're in the whole 8 million jobs. What are these jobs going to come from?
We're going to have our wand and go, Matt, abracadabra, here you go. I think just in the immediate, what we decide to do on taxes, there's a lot of uncertainty. If we do nothing on the tax front, come January 1, everyone will feel an increase in taxes. And so I think from that perspective, when you're an employer trying to make decisions about payroll and whether or not to grow, kind of stabilizing that climate, I think, is really, really important. Obviously, that's my perspective. But yeah, I think something with taxes, I think some of the things coming out of the Department of Labor from a regulatory perspective, there's a lot of uncertainty that creates for an employer yet again, do I grow, do I not grow? How do I need to account for the future in order to prepare myself for a potential labor employee to show up and say, aha, got you, now I have more fines. So I think from a Republican perspective, it's sort of stabilizing a lot of uncertainty.
Andrea.
I think the Democrats will say kind of yes and, and because I expect the Democrats to, want to see a deal on taxes fairly quickly. But I think there will also be, you'll see, I think this India trip will immediately flip to kind of a go around the country and make connections between kind of what he's doing internationally to try and open up markets and how that is benefiting actual companies here in the United States. I also think, I know from being in any Duke room, I know the least amount of finance in a group of women from Duke. So, but my understanding is that some of the things that they're doing with the bond, the issuance of the new big bond program, and what the Fed is doing and the White House's interaction with that, I think if it can be explained, I mean, obviously I don't really understand it, but I get that it's actually a pretty big deal in terms of investment. But I think the White House is going to try and do a much better job at articulating and communicating what they're doing with some of those structural economic tools they have that they have been using more effectively now. I hope they will be using them more and more effectively.
I think there's a consensus. The White House at the very least, didn't explain very well what they were doing or wanted to do, and the Republican argument has been they should have, they were doing the wrong things.
Right.
So it's partly explanation, but it's also partly the policy. All right, I'm looking for hands around the room right here. Yes, you want to stand up?
I'm just curious because of what you just mentioned. Traditionally, the government, the executive branch, the president, has been separate from the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve has been an independent agency. And now, like from what I've read in the Wall Street Journal, is Obama's been commenting and trying to defend the moves of Bernanke recently with the $600 million repurchase. So how much more involvement do you see, or where do you see the relationship going between the executive branch and the Federal Reserve? And also, Obama had put out a target for growing exports, and you can throw a target out there,
Right.
but we need a market to go. We need to have the products and services that the international market actually wants. So what steps can we do, whether it's led by the Republicans or the Democrats? I don't really care, I'm an independent, I just want to see you guys do something together. I've been unemployed for 11 months, so it'd be really nice to get a job. What are you going to do that, to increase free trade and increase consumption in our exports?
That's a great question.
Yeah. Financial markets are not my deal. So I can't really, unfortunately, I can't talk about the relationship, the administration and the Federal Reserve. Maybe Andrea can.
As I said earlier, I've learned in a group of Duke women never to talk about economics because a bunch of you have MBAs. I know that, just because demographically that's what it's like when you talk to a bunch of Duke women. I do think, though, something that you do and that you could talk about here is actually kind of what we're doing on the front on education. I think this is a really interesting issue in that it could end up being very bipartisan. It's no question. There's no question that we are not doing what we could. We don't have we have a small team compared to India and China, and we don't get everybody to try out for the team, right? I mean, just if you look at what our elementary and secondary education system is producing, we aren't getting everybody to try out for the team. So when you have you have the small competitor compared to the population of India and China long term, and you're not educating everybody to actually participate in the economy, we aren't going to get there on the exports question. And I do think that that's something that the Obama administration is trying to do with Race to the Top. And a lot of the principles he's talking about really, frankly, have been talked about by Republicans like Boehner for, 15 years. So I do think that's actually, I know it's not directly an answer to your question, but it's one of the few things I feel like we could actually work on together. So,
I was just going to say, before Catherine answers on education, my understanding is the White House has at least in their public statements, have said, we are not going to comment on this. So if the president has been commenting on it, I'm not aware of it. I mean, we have not been reporting on it on the NewsHour. I don't know which Wall Street Journal article, I don't know whether one of you know what that's a reference to.
I just wanted to say that we support the direction. It wasn't,
Right.
I was just more the term that he was commenting
Yeah,
on.
okay.
Anything whatsoever.
Yeah. But that's the only, that you now know everything I know about what the Fed has
I
done.
think really
But
fast,
go ahead and comment.
I mean,
Yeah.
as far as trade, obviously, there are certain things that we can do immediately. There's several outstanding trade agreements that could be addressed and passed by Congress. I think there's one with Colombia and Korea, and there's a third. Panama. Those have been sort of on the docket for a while, which is something that I think Republicans would really like to push through. Obviously,
they're really unpopular in the middle of the country.
Yeah.
It's a problem.
exactly.
And
So,
waivers, obviously.
but anyway, so that definitely trade, and I think a little bit of what Andrea said, I think there is certainly common ground on education reform. I spent some time in India this past spring, and I'd like to say that there's a slight misnomer about all of India's children being educated. They just passed a compulsory education law only in 2007. In a population of 1.3 billion, there are a ton of people who are illiterate. But the individuals who do go through their education system, both in their government schools as well as their private sector schools, it's similar to the British style that you're taking exams in the 10th grade that set the course for the rest of your career. You spend your last 2 years of high school studying. If you do really well in science, it is apparent then that you are going to be a doctor. And that's decided when you are 16. And you spend the next 2 years doing science. And then if you do really well on sort of the A-level exam, then universities will tell you as a student whether or not you can even apply to their school. And they're very, very specific, both in medicine, sort of the medicine-centric or sort of liberal arts, different things like that. So many kids don't even get into their Indian university, so that's why they come elsewhere, including the United States. But there is common ground. I think school choice, the administration, I think, has done a great job talking about choice. They've also had to confront the teachers union, which has been a very difficult challenge, I think, for both President Obama as well as for Secretary Duncan. I think Republicans would say both the president and the secretary have exercised choice, but they have not done a great job of standing up to the unions, and that the president sends his kids to, I believe, Sidwell Friends, and Secretary Duncan lives in Northern Virginia because he did not want to subject his kids to DC public schools. So I think school choice is absolutely something that we can agree on, at least with expansion of charters. And I think there's a lot of other things about creating greater incentives for teachers, kind of allowing teachers to be treated the professionals that they absolutely are. I think we've kind of gone in a wrong direction. So it's possible. I think we just have to wait and see.
Okay, question right here.
Yes, I had just a couple of things. As far as the financial, I think Catherine and Andrea are probably two of the people who admit the fact that they don't know what to do about the financial situation. I don't see that. I wonder whether anybody really understands what is going on, and how can a Senate or a House of Representatives make any changes or do anything when they really don't understand it. As far as the health care is concerned, as far as I understood it, the bills passed was a very general bill, and the devils are in the details. And how can the Republicans come in and say, okay, we're going to repeal all this? We don't even know what it is yet, as far as I understand it and what I've read. And for the education, I would say it would be just nice if people could read and write. Because I see people in my office who can't get ahead, who've been through the DC system, who are smart cookies, but they can't read and write worth a darn. And that's a shame. So, does anybody understand what this economy is all about and
Well,
what to do about it?
I can say one thing about that, is it just, I think it was Friday night on the news hours of night, the latest jobless numbers came out where the unemployment rate stayed the same, but there were, I think, 160,000 jobs created, 159,000 jobs created in the private sector. There has been growth. It's just been very, very, very slow, and the experts talk about we're in a sideways situation. So whom did I interview? Paul Krugman, the liberal economist, and Douglas Holtz-Aiken, the conservative economist, who was John McCain's chief economic advisor. They acknowledge, the both of them, that nobody knows the exact right way to get jobs going. They both, Holtz-Aiken would argue, better tax environment. Krugman would argue more stimulus, but both of them acknowledge none of that, that it's going to take a climate for business to just feel that it can start creating jobs and it's going to happen, and there really isn't much the government can do, they would both argue. And they both kind of, shook their heads and said that,
But I think that
but
part of the reason the government can't do anything is actually because there's a structural political problem right now. In that, I think that one of the reasons the Fed has had to be so active is that because the legislative branch, which could be doing the stimulating, has been so, frankly, yes, it's not going to do any more stimulating, right? You could say there was an initial infusion of $787 billion, but, in an economy our size, that's like a drop in the bucket, and it was 2 years ago, right? And so I do think that, and there's a real structural problem in that we have a divided Congress now, so there's no way anybody would believe that there would be some kind of new stimulus bill, right, that would get through the House or the Senate. So we are just stuck in this environment that it has to be on the other side of the... I guess what's so interesting to me is it's not that has to be the way it is, it's just the way it is because of our politics.
Because of politics, that's the way it is. You want to comment on what she said about health care, and then, do you want to weigh in on that?
I just want to weigh in on that. So I remember from Econ 101, C plus I plus G equals GNP from Samuelson, which is consumers, investment, and government. So if consumers not weighing in, investment's not weighing in, doesn't it have to be government? And a government deficit is not necessarily a bad thing. It's you're reinvesting your money in what we all think is a good investment, and somebody's got to weigh in. So, do you think that with this Republican infusion of folks, they're going to put more money into a stimulus or pull back?
They're going to be pulling back.
Yeah.
I think if you said what I said earlier, is that the goal is, if you look at the spending that's been done over the last 2 years, including under a Democrat majority and a Republican president with the TARP bailout, which a lot of individuals had problems with, our goal is to go back and sort of constrain spending, just to sort of alleviate the tax burden on individuals. Some individuals would say that that's the wrong direction because individuals believe that sort of the government programs that we've created are helpful, but I think I would also pose the question that in 2000, when we passed the 2008 or fiscal year 2008 budget, were people complaining that was not enough spending? So, it's a different place, obviously, that we are in 2010 going into 2011, but we have spent a lot of money in the last 2 years that I'm not quite sure have created the same sort of jobs that we were hoping for.
Another piece that's going to come up is whether to extend unemployment benefits again. This is going to come up again. It's going to come up regularly, and you're going to see a division between the two parties. Unanswered part of the health care question, I don't know that anybody has a final answer on that. Do you want to answer? Just make a quick comment.
I think just the part of the health care bill, yes, there's a lot that was sort of deferred to the administration to interpret, but there was also a lot of things, sort of new mandates on employers that we've been hearing from a number of both large and small employers that they're going to be required to maintain a certain level of benefits. We've also heard sort of one of the things, and this is sort of my partisan hat, that the president promised that if you want to keep the health care that you have, then you can. Well, we're finding that that's not necessarily the case, because there are certain requirements and mandates put in the health care bill that said you have to have a minimum standard benefit. And if you have what's called a high deductible health plan that has very limited coverage, but it covers the catastrophic, that's not going to be an eligible plan for you come several years from now. As far as costs, we're seeing already from both CBO, OMB, and CMS, and these are all acronyms, so I apologize. CMS is Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. OMB is Office of Management and Budget, and CBO is the Congressional Budget Office. These are all different they do a lot of accounting, and they have excellent bean counters. And they're saying that the cost of the bill is actually much more expensive. You also have provisions that the president, I think last week in his speech, that he said that he had been shellacked, was that he's sort of conceding that the 990 form, which is sort of any time a business has any expense over $500, they're going to have to report that to the IRS. Well, that's a huge burden to employees. So there are certain things that absolutely can be repealed and replaced with something else.
But I do think it's hard to unring the bell on insurance reform. And I think that's going to be really challenging. One of the things the bill did, for instance, it said you can keep your children on your plan until age 26. It's hard to unring the bell on that.
Which is something that Republicans do support.
Right. So it's you know what I'm saying?
So
like,
it's repeal and replace.
Replace.
Good things that we like.
I guess that's what I'm saying, is it's really complicated because there are a bunch of things that kind of on the insurance reform that went into effect immediately. And then there were some structural things that were supposed to take 2 years. And it's really complicated how to unwind it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So very quick comment, and that is, I think a lot of Republicans would say, in the example that was cited, is that the government spending crowds out private investment, especially in the case of California, when you have a state that's actually borrowing money to pay for unemployment benefits. So it's just simply a transfer of wealth. Quick observation, in my view, I think one unreported story, and that is, it's a little inside baseball. Michael Steele, the RNC chairman, has actually received a lot of heat for spending this time out on the bus, the Fire Pelosi bus. And I think the unreported story is really a story of Governor Kane in Virginia, and actually Virginia turning from what had been considered a blue state to now a very red state. And nobody is talking about whether or not the chairman, DNC chairman Kane, is effective. My final question is going to one of the maybe legs of the stool, and that is, unless we have a serious conversation about entitlement reform, we're really just kicking the can down the road. And I say, if you can't get something done in Congress, you appoint a commission. And this has, gone through a number of commissions, and I'm wondering, is this anywhere on the radar screen besides maybe Paul Ryan?
Well, it is. I mean, I can just pick up on that very quickly, and that is this commission that was appointed by President Obama, that's headed by former Republican Senator Alan Simpson and Erskine Bowles, who was the White House Chief of Staff under President Clinton. I mean, they have been working hard. They're going to come out with a set of recommendations in early December, I think it is, in the next couple of weeks. And I think both sides, it's going to be incumbent on both political parties to respond in a serious way to that. I think that's going to be the only, honest to God, serious bite at the apple that we have, because it's coming from a middle, presumably middle of the road body. We have every reason to think they're going to recommend both entitlement cuts and some kind of revenue changes, and we'll see. Will Democrats be willing to go along with entitlement cuts of any significant size, and will Republicans be willing to go along with revenue tax, potentially tax increases of any significant size? And that's, but you all can comment on that. I do want to get some other questions too. Yes.
There's going to have to be a vote to raise the debt ceiling soon, and you have this large class of freshmen who are all sworn to not raise government spending in any way. Do you see a scenario where they could vote not to raise the debt ceiling and plunge the American dollar?
I think it's conceivable, and we've sort of talked about that internally and what actually would happen. And right now, I don't have an answer for you. I can't even speak candidly, like I don't know. But it is something that we're going to have to address, I think, as soon as February. I think that we'll reach the debt limit about then. So, yeah, it's going to be a very tough vote.
And there are Democrats who are saying they're not going to walk the plank on that one unless they get enough Republicans on board. It's going to be quite a drama when it comes along. Let's see. I'm gonna have to leave in a minute. I'm going to leave both of them, but let's take right here. Yeah.
In the tough economic times, America has continued to be a very generous nation, which is clearly important for foreign policy. But I think if most Americans realize the lack of stewardship and oversight that America has had with respect to our foreign dollars, either in bilateral commitments or through multilateral organizations, they'd be shocked. I'm curious as to which party is going to have the courage to stand up and call for better oversight over things. And I'll give you a couple quick examples. Paul Volcker's Oil for Food. I can count on my hands the number of companies that have been prosecuted in the past 6 years for the billions that disappeared there. The Commission on Public Integrity in Iraq just came out with their report. $400 million lost in 2009. 4 ministers still sitting in office there. 52 director generals who've all been implicated in the corrupt practices. The billions that have disappeared in Afghanistan. 2007 documented 9 out of every $10 at the World Bank goes into somebody's pocket. I understand working with other countries and giving them money is important, but neither party both say they're anti-corruption. Yeah. But I've yet to see anybody have the courage to stand up and actually really do something about it. So which one is going to do something?
And that's a terrific question. I have to sneak out very rudely. I'm going to do that. I'm going to let both of them pick up on that. And then there are a number of other great questions out there that are coming. But thank you so much.
Judy. We'll continue to let you guys answer a few more questions. We probably want to wrap up in the next 10 to 15 minutes because I know people have children to get back to.
I think, Leader Boehner has articulated that Congress has not done a very good job of providing oversight. And in talking with committee staff at Foreign Affairs Committee, I know that Congresswoman Ross-Lehtinen, who is the likely incoming chair of that committee, has indicated that she will be having many, many hearings over the State Department and where funds have gone. And I imagine HASC equally on the House side, and I can only speak from the House perspective, they will likely be pretty engaged on what the Defense Department's doing, especially with the sort of hundreds of billions of, if not trillions of dollars that we've allocated to them over the last decade. So I think where our dollars are going, I think is something that is a huge theme that will be part of hearings in the coming Congress.
And Catherine, just to clarify, you said that will go back a decade or so? That
I'm not.
It's not just the 2 years. They're going to go back.
I'm not exactly sure how long they'll go back, but I think there are obviously a number of programs that, or just looking at where our dollars have gone, we've neglected to do that, both Republicans and Democrats. So, and where they're going now, yeah. Especially when I have meetings all the time, they say, well, based on the foreign aid that you've given us, and we've seen great increases, you need to continue to give us millions more. And I said, really? Well, tell me how and why, because what you are doing, is that effective? And if so, where can I get other dollars? Because I don't really know, this pot is pretty small, so.
I actually work for the Foreign Relations.
Oh, good.
But I think one.
Oh, on the Senate side.
Yeah, on the Senate side, yeah, for Lugar. And I think one of the big things that's coming up is the capital increases for the multilateral development banks. And they want more American dollars, and the claims that it's really necessary to help pull not just Americans but other people out of poverty in this really tough economy, global economy. And one of the big questions is how can we not only talk about our economic reform in our own country, but reform at a lot of those banks and international institutions where we're giving a lot of money, and how can we make better decisions there and make them more responsive to our interests and fighting, fighting for issues that we're concerned about. So that's one big thing that's sort of on the
Perhaps if the U.S. would require complete transparency from the multilateral organizations, that they have to open their books, which the U.S. has not required here to date, it would make a difference.
My boss is on that trip.
Kim, do you want?
Yeah, you can take over.
Oh, you want me to? Okay, go for it.
Yeah, I have a question for Catherine. In the interest of transparency here, I'm an Obama fan. So I really don't know much about your boss. And he's going to be a very powerful figure in our government very soon. And so I'd love to know, you said you've worked for him for 2 years. I'm very interested in you telling us what makes him tick, what is he passionate about. You listed the four things in sort of the new version of Contract with America or something. But those are something that came out of this feedback you got, and you're being responsive. I'm interested in the man. Where's he coming from? What drives him? What's he going to care about? What's he going to push through beyond being responsive to come through on websites?
That's a great question. So he came to Congress he was elected in 1990, so pre-1994 sort of new revolution. He was born in southeast Ohio, in Reading, Ohio, which is the suburbs of Cincinnati. He was the second of 12 kids. His parents owned a bar. It's Andy's Bar, I think, or Andy's Tavern, that was started by his grandfather. And he worked every job known to mankind, swept the floors, cleaned the toilets, as he would say, both being one of 12 kids, but also working in a bar that it taught him how to work with any, and then he usually uses an expletive, type of individual that on the face of the planet. But he, he's a really laid back guy. He is a prolific smoker. He loves his red wine. And, he does love golf. His tan is actually legitimate. Everyone questions it, but it is legitimate. I haven't seen his shirt sleeves in a while, but so I'm told. But he is out on the golf course a lot. So on the weekends, if you're a leader, you do a lot of time fundraising, and he likes to have his fundraisers on the golf course. The president, as you all know, plays a lot of golf as well. So just like in my boss's defense. But what brought him to Washington, he worked his way through college. He went to Xavier University. It took him 7 years, and started working for a plastics company, and eventually went on to own it. There's a Time magazine and a Newsweek article and a New York Times article. There's a ton of different articles about him. But eventually he went on to own it, and is actually, I guess, became a millionaire of some sort. But what got him into politics is that he was frustrated with his neighborhood, and there was something he didn't like. And so someone said, well, if you're sick and tired with our neighborhood, then why don't you get involved in the homeowners association? So he did, and sort of led the homeowners association. Then he got frustrated about something else, so he went to Columbus and was a state representative. And then in 1990, and I don't remember the specifics, but his representative for what we call now the Ohio 8th District, which is the southeast, his boss or his representative was engulfed in some sort of scandal. And so he ran against him, probably some others did too, and he won the primary. And so he's been in Congress for 20 years. A number of individuals have said, well, gosh, he's so established and he's sort of inside the beltway. If you hear him give speeches today, they're very much the same as they were 20 years ago. That what brought him to Washington was that he was sort of sick and tired of government constraint, of regulation, feeling overtaxed, overburdened, and those are still sort of the principles that he has fought for. A few other things, he was sort of a deputy of Newt Gingrich, so this isn't his first tour of leadership. He was selected in 94, 95 to be the conference chair of the House Republicans, and served in that capacity for 2 Congresses. Sort of as Newt was going out, there were some other casualties, and that included my boss.
J.C. Watts then took over as conference chair, who is African American. Also, he's from Oklahoma, I believe. So Boehner licked his wounds and kind of went back and sort of into the regular ranks. In 2001, I feel like I'm giving this like bio. Soon he'll be coming up to the stage. In 2001, he was selected to head up the Education and Workforce Committee. He had been on that committee with people like Dick Armey and others, and he really kind of rolled up his sleeves and did all kinds of things as being the sort of lead guy on No Child Left Behind, for all of its good and bad. I will say in his defense that we now know what kids actually know, and it's sort of you look at every single demographic, not just the really high performers. He's also done a lot of things on Head Start and pension reform. He was a union guy, but he tried to be involved in his union, and the union rejected him. So I don't know if that's a chip on his shoulder or not, but he's sort of, individuals have a right to organize, but let's not force it on everybody. So he's a really easygoing guy. Some of his pet peeves is if you're having a bad hair day, pray that you don't see the boss, because he comments on her hair. Whether you're a guy or a girl, he will comment on your hair. And so he doesn't like it when women wear their hair back. He likes their hair down. If a guy has their hair too long over their ears, he'll be like, what is this? What's going on here? You need to look professional, which is sort of his pet peeve. But he's a man with vision, and he's a man with passion. He's not a micromanager. I work with an excellent team, and we're all sort of invested in carrying out the goals that we've collectively set. So he's a really great guy to work for, and I've really enjoyed it. So sorry, it's a lot.
One more question? One more question? Okay. Back over there.
Hi, given the economic environment, how do your respective constituencies view energy policy as a priority?
This is like, well, there's a big block of the Democratic Party that would put this as like one of their top issues. There are a ton of activists, and quite frankly, they're pretty unhappy with the White House. Being the Democratic president after 8 years, of the opposition party holding the White House means that you kind of come in with this set of expectations that may or may not be realistic. And I, in their defense, I don't think the expectations were realistic about the cap and trade bill from the beginning. But I also think they overpromised to the left in the Democratic Party on their ability to deliver. So I think the expectations weren't fair, but they helped create them. I think it's going nowhere, the bill that was, talked about 2 years ago. I think there are things that could go somewhere on energy, but I'd say it is one of the grand disappointments of, kind of environmental activists in the Democratic Party. And it's one that the White House is going to needs to figure out a political strategy as well as a substantive strategy on how to handle in terms of kind of how to talk to the base of voters that really care about this, which they don't have right now. So I'm being really candid.
I think from a Republican perspective, I know that there is certainly an interest to do something. If you remember in 2008, in August, the lights were shut down and House Republicans staged a coup, and we had people in on the House floor, talking on the House floor every single day of the August recess, I think except for weekends. And it was sort of an all of the above strategy, which was sort of drill here, drill now, but also let's explore other options like nuclear energy, sort of restore our investment in that, as well as look at clean coal and look at a number of other things. We don't really know who's going to be the incoming chair. That will be selected probably later this year. I don't think it's going to be Mr. Barton as much as he'd like to be. But I think it's something that
both, if it's either Fred Upton or Mr. Shimkus, I think it's something that they'll probably dabble in, but I don't think it would be a huge comprehensive bill like we saw last summer.
Well, I know that people have a lot more questions, but I want to comment that it has been incredibly refreshing to discuss politics for the last hour and a half without a raised voice, a crossword, with complete civility and mutual respect. I want to thank Catherine and Andrea for being with us. Andrea, thank you for being here on such short notice. You did a remarkable job. And I invite you to stick around and mingle a bit, and hope to see you at the next Women's Forum event. Thank you for being here.